They made it! The tanks are finally here! We're saved!
December 19th, 1944. General Eisenhower's headquarters, Verdun. The room smelled of wet wool and cigarette smoke. Outside, German tanks were tearing through the Ardennes, creating what would soon be called the Bulge. Inside, staff officers hunched over maps, their faces gray with exhaustion and something worse, fear. When Lieutenant General George Patton walked in, some of them didn't even look up. They'd heard the reports. The surprise was complete. 250,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks. The entire American First Army was in chaos. Units shattered, communications gone. And this man, this volatile, controversial commander with a reputation for reckless aggression, was about to make a promise so ridiculous it bordered on fantasy. Eisenhower asked the question everyone was thinking. How long would it take you to turn your Third Army north? Patton didn't hesitate. 48 hours. I can attack with 3 divisions in 2 days. The room went silent. Then someone laughed. A short, bitter sound quickly smothered. Pull 6 combat divisions out of active fighting. Turn them 90 march them 100 miles through the worst winter in decades, all while maintaining combat readiness in 48 hours. It was absurd. It violated every principle of military logistics. One staff officer muttered what others were thinking. He's finally lost his mind. But Patton wasn't lying and he wasn't insane. What nobody in that room knew, what the laughing German commanders celebrating their surprise attack definitely didn't know, was that Patton had already planned for this exact scenario. 3 contingency plans drafted days earlier, routes mapped, units pre-desated, orders ready to transmit, while others scrambled to understand what was happening. Patton had already moved beyond reaction to execution. This is the story of how the general the Germans feared most and the Allies trusted least turned an impossible logistics problem into the Reich's final disaster on the Western Front. George Smith Patton, Jr. was 59 years old and running out of time. Not running out of years, though at his age, with his habits, that was coming too, running out of war. The thing he'd spent his entire life preparing for was going to end. And if it ended without him proving what he knew to be true, then what had any of it meant? He'd been born into a military family in 1885, raised on stories of ancestors who'd fought in every American war going back to the Revolution. His grandfather had died at the Third Battle of Winchester in the Civil War. That legacy sat on Patton like a physical weight. By December 1944, he commanded the Third Army. Over 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, the most aggressive armored force in the European theater. But that wasn't enough. Not for Patton, because despite everything he'd accomplished, North Africa, Sicily, the sprint across France, there were still whispers. Patton, he's good when the enemy's running, great at pursuit, but put him against real resistance. The fall of 1944 had been brutal. His advance through Lorraine toward the fortified city of Metz had ground down to a crawl. Bitter fighting, heavy casualties, supply problems, the kind of attritional warfare that made him look like every other general. And then there was Sicily, August 1943. 2 separate incidents where he'd physically struck soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue. The incidents nearly destroyed his career. General Eisenhower seriously considered sending him home in disgrace. The press got hold of it. There were calls for court-martial, but Eisenhower knew something the newspapers didn't. The Germans were terrified of Patton. Intelligence intercepts showed Wehrmacht commanders specifically asking, "Where is Patton?" before making strategic decisions. So Eisenhower kept him but sidelined him, made him part of a deception operation, the fictional First Army group supposedly preparing to invade at Kalala. Patton spent months as a decoy while other men led the D-Day invasion. For a man who believed he was destined for martial greatness, it was a kind of death. By mid-December, Patton's G2 intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Coe, was seeing patterns in German radio traffic. Unusual quiet units disappearing from the order of battle. The kind of radio silence that preceded something big. Coe brought his concerns to Patton on December 9th, a full week before the German attack. "General, I think they're massing for an offensive, probably in the Ardennes, the sectors lightly held." And Patton cut him off. "I know, I've been thinking the same thing." They looked at maps together. The Ardennes made sense from a German perspective. It was where they'd broken through in 1940, routing the French. The terrain was terrible. Dense forests, narrow roads, but that also meant it was lightly defended. The Allies considered it impossible for armor in winter. The Germans were counting on that assumption. Patton did something that would later be called either brilliant foresight or paranoid overplanning. He ordered his staff to draft contingency plans for a 90-degree turn north, 3 separate plans, each moving different numbers of divisions. He didn't tell Eisenhower, didn't clear it with anyone, just had his staff quietly do the work. When the attack came on December 16th, Patton was in his headquarters at Nancy when the phone rang. It was General Bradley's chief of staff. "George, we've got a situation. The Germans have attacked in the Ardennes. It's big." Patton's first reaction wasn't panic. It was something close to satisfaction. "Good. We can kill them there just as well as anywhere else." The meeting at Verdun on December 19th has been described in dozens of histories, but most accounts miss the psychological dynamic in that room. Eisenhower was under immense pressure. Churchill was asking pointed questions about American competence. The press was starting to get wind of the disaster. German radio was broadcasting claims of a massive Allied defeat. The generals gathered around the table represented different philosophies of war. British Field Marshal Montgomery, cautious, methodical, obsessed with set-piece battles. Bradley, solid, reliable, but clearly shaken by the collapse of his First Army. And Patton, whom many in the room still saw as a liability. Eisenhower opened with a deliberate choice of words. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster." Patton, according to multiple accounts, grinned. "Hell, let's have the guts to let them go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." That's when Eisenhower asked the question. What Patton proposed violated everything the other generals knew about military movement. To understand why, you need to grasp what turning an army actually means. The Third Army wasn't a single unit. It was 6 full divisions. Each division contained roughly 15,000 men. They had thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, supply trains stretching for miles. These units were actively engaged in combat operations around Metz and in the Saar region. They were in contact with the enemy. The roads they'd need to use weren't modern highways. They were narrow country lanes, many unpaved. In mid-December, temperatures were dropping below freezing. Snow and ice covered everything. A single vehicle breakdown could block an entire column for hours. The logistics were nightmarish. Ammunition dumps had to be rerouted, fuel supplies repositioned, and all of this had to happen in 72 hours while maintaining operational security. When Patton said 48 hours, he wasn't guessing. His chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, had already divided the contingency plans into phases. The first orders went out before Patton even left Verdun. The night of December 19th, across a 100-mile front, American units began the most complex redeployment in military history. The 4th Armored Division, which would lead the attack toward Bastogne, had to disengage from combat near Saarbrücken, reposition 90 mir north, and arrive ready to fight. They did it in less than 48 hours, losing only a handful of vehicles to mechanical failure. It shouldn't have been possible. By every conventional military calculation, it wasn't possible. What enabled this logistical miracle was unseen. The Red Ball Express mentality. The supply corps simply rooted convoys in motion, treating the repositioning as a continuation of movement, not a halt. Supply officers, given immediate decentralized authority, created ad hoc gas and ammunition dumps along the new route overnight. Mass production as a reserve where German logistics mandated repair. American logistics enabled replacement. For every vehicle that broke down in the frozen mud, another was immediately pulled from the massive supply reserves staged in France, preventing critical bottlenecks. Superior communications. Crucial orders activating the shift were sent via encrypted radio, as Patton left Verdun while German units relying on slow and compromised motorcycle couriers conceded an unassailable head start. Meanwhile, at German headquarters, the mood was triumphant. German intelligence knew Patton's Third Army was to the south, but they assumed correctly by normal military standards that such a large force couldn't possibly reposition quickly enough to matter. Field Marshal von Rundstedt estimated that Patton would need at least 2 weeks to mount a serious counterattack. The German command's failure was an act of self-imposed industrial blindness. Hitler's master plan hinged on capturing Allied fuel depots, particularly those at Spa and Stavelot. The most advanced spearhead, Camp Group Piper, was quickly compromised, reducing its powerful columns of Tiger II to slow-moving bottlenecks on secondary roads. Piper knew they did not have enough fuel to reach the objective, and would have to capture American supplies. But Patton's Third Army, moving with full fuel and ammunition reserves, represented an industrial reality, the GE. But Patton's Third Army, moving with full fuel and ammunition reserves, represented an industrial reality the Germans had already dismissed. American logistics did not rely on luck. They relied on an inexhaustible capacity for resupply. They had no idea what was coming. No idea that the man they feared most was already in motion. December 22nd, 1944. The Third Army's attack jumped off at 0600 hours, in conditions that would have stopped most military operations cold. The temperature was 8° F, 13° C. A massive storm system had moved in overnight, dropping 6 in of new snow on top of the ice already covering the roads. The cold killed in ways combat didn't. Weapons froze. The oil in machine guns turned to sludge. Tank engines wouldn't start without heating the oil pans with blowtorches. And yet the attack went forward. The soldiers of the Third Army faced an enemy few movies show, the terrain as an equal foe. Every mile gained by the 4th Armored Division was a battle against the frozen ground. American infantry wrapped burlap sacks around their boots and tanks crews stuffed newspapers into their uniforms for insulation. The snow made movement unpredictable. German material inferiority, compounding their fuel crisis. Many German vehicles ran on synthetic oil that performed poorly in the extreme cold. Their armored behemoths, the Tiger and Panther tanks, were logistical nightmares susceptible to cold weather failures, trapping them in the very forests they were meant to dominate. The 4th Armored Division's advance toward Bastogne covered only 7 miles the first day. 7 miles through defended terrain, fighting the Germans and the weather simultaneously. Every village became a separate battle. Tank warfare became brutal close-quarters fighting. But Patton had numbers. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more took its place. The supply lines he'd established kept ammunition and fuel flowing forward despite the conditions. The town of Bastogne sat at a critical crossroads. 7 roads converged there. By December 22nd, the 101st Airborne Division had been encircled for 6 days. The situation was desperate. The 101st was running out of ammunition. German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum under white flag. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, read the message. He wrote a single word: nuts. That one-word refusal became legend. But it was Patton's relief force that would make the legend meaningful. On December 20th, Patton had summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, with an unusual request. Chaplain, I want you to write a prayer for good weather. The prayer O'Neill composed was distributed to every man in the Third Army. Almighty and most merciful Father, grant us fair weather for battle. On December 23rd, the clouds broke. Allied fighter bombers that had been grounded for a week took to the air. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German infantry advancing under the cover of the storm suddenly found themselves exposed to devastating air attacks. The breakthrough to Bastogne came at 1650 hours on December 26th. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding a platoon of Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, was pushing up a snow-covered road. He shouted, "Come here, this is the 4th Armored." The corridor Bogus had opened was only 500 YD wide, but it was enough. Within hours, more tanks and trucks were pouring through, bringing supplies to the besieged garrison. By late December, the German offensive had reached its high water mark and begun to recede. Fuel supplies were now completely exhausted. The Luftwaffe was shot out of the sky. By the time Bastogne was relieved, the offensive had already failed. The Germans just didn't know it yet. Patton understood this intuitively. In a conversation with Bradley on December 28th, he said, "Brad, this time the crowd stuck his head in a meat grinder, and I've got hold of the handle." The systematic rooting out of the Germans began. The abandoned hardware told the final damning story. Kampfgruppe Piper was eventually forced to retreat on foot, abandoning nearly all its tanks, including dozens of formidable Tiger IIs, simply because they had been without fuel for over 2 days. The German gamble had failed because it required perfection in execution and an immediate collapse of Allied resistance. Instead, it met Patton's prepared offensive, transforming the Ardennes forest into a massive, unreoverable cemetery for Germany's last operational armored reserves. By January 16th, when American forces from north and south met at Houffalize, the Bulge was eliminated. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men. Over 700 tanks destroyed or abandoned. The strategic cost was higher. The Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's last operational reserves. When the Soviets launched their winter offensive on the Eastern Front in January, there was nothing left to stop them. But America could replace these losses. Germany couldn't. The 72-hour redeployment of 6 divisions wasn't luck. It was professional excellence combined with foresight. The fact that he drafted contingency plans before the German attack showed strategic vision. After the war, when German generals were interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, many were asked about Patton. General Gunther Blumrit said, "We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most modern commander on the battlefield. We did not expect him to react so quickly. We thought we would have at least 2 weeks before the Third Army could respond. He did it in 2 days. This was extraordinary. The Germans had always feared Patton. Now they knew why." In his personal diary, Patton wrote an entry on December 27th. "The ability to get the Third Army turned and attacking in under 3 days will probably be considered a masterpiece of logistics and planning, but it's really quite simple when you know what you're doing." He'd spent his entire life preparing for this moment. When the moment came, he wasn't improvising. He was executing plans built on decades of study and experience. Winston Churchill wrote about the battle. "This was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." The officers who laughed when Patton said 48 hours were wrong because Patton operated beyond convention. He understood that in war, as in life, the impossible is often just the difficult that nobody's willing to attempt. The Germans laughed, too, until they stopped laughing until they found themselves retreating through snow-stained crimson with their own blood, pursued by an army that had appeared like a winter storm. The Ardennes became not Hitler's triumph, but his final defeat. The blood crimson that stained those winter fields was German, not American. Don't forget subscribe for more WW2 documentary videos.